Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Be the Revolution, how to create vision, strategies, and solidarity for sustainable social movements. I am very excited to bring you today's guest, Lisa Fithian. She is a direct action organizer. She's a trainer, I would say probably master trainer, and Rebel Alliance movement general. You might call her. She has been organizing for decades and has been part of some of the most significant direct actions in this country's recent history. Ladies and gentlemen, Lisa Fithian.
Thank you so much, Jay. Appreciate it.
Yep. And she also recently just put out this book called Shut It Down, Stories from a Fierce, Loving Resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty excited about that.
Yeah, and also as I was preparing for this interview, I also came across something on my bookshelf that you wrote the introduction to the post 9/11 version of Abby Hoffman's Steal This Book.
I did. Abby was one of my early mentors, and still part of that family.
Yeah, and which is interesting because Abby Hoffman, for me, I would consider myself also an acolyte of Abby Hoffman and, Jerry Rubin and their tactics. I found them to be so inspiring in terms of, how do you get through to the general public to get them to stand for something that's way outside of their comfort zone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they were masters of imagination, and we need that.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about, when you were coming up and your experiences with them? What did you take away from your relationship with Abby and your mentorship from him?
I mean, I think there were, one of the things is the importance of creativity in whatever actions we choose to do. We have to, bring our actions to life, have color, engage people, because we know that that's going to attract people. And, all of this work of organizing is about bringing more and more people into the fore. I mean, Abby was also a master strategist and an understander that there's not one strategy, you need multiple strategies. And he also understood that we had to do work that captured the media and to use that as one of our vehicles to tell the story. And so I just really, I worked with him early on some fights to stop a major Army Corps of Engineers project on the St. Lawrence River. And over a year of organizing, it was hugely successful. And so I guess I would also say that, part of my early lessons with Abby is that you can actually win things, even when it looks impossible, winning is possible too.
Yeah. And I think that's so important because I think the paradigm sometimes on the left end is that, the establishment wins so often because they have the resources. And so I think a lot of times, we define ourselves by the fight rather than by, having achievable outcomes, in my opinion. And if you define yourself by the fight, a lot of times we end up fighting each other instead of really focusing on what do we need to do to know what our outcome is and generate an outcome. And just a little word about what were some of your favorite Abby Hoffman moments or actions?
Well, he came to my college and talked about this community organizing internship. So I was like, awesome, and filled out the application, signed up. He wrote me back, A+, come on up. But I couldn't reach him and I couldn't figure out if it was happening. So I was graduating from college. I just packed my car and drove up to the St. Lawrence River. And then within 20 minutes of my arriving, he and Johanna arrived. Johanna was his running mate. And I became their flower gardener for the summer. And so Abby and I would cruise around the St. Lawrence River, liberating flower bulbs, planting them in his garden and creating a lot of beauty. But again, it was also, working together to try and figure out how we move things like the Canadian government or the 8 Great Lakes governors or the New York State Assembly to come out against this project. And so it was great hands-on learning. And I feel really honored to have had that opportunity.
Yeah, one of my best friends was one of the lawyers for the Chicago 7, Chicago 8 was Leonard Weinglass, and his younger brother is my best friend, and he grew up with them, and I get to hear all these stories. My favorite was probably when they were, trying to mobilize the kids to stop the war. He and Allen Ginsberg leading this action to surround the Pentagon, and their plan was to hold hands, surround the Pentagon, and levitate the Pentagon with their energy. And you see, like, you have the army or the National Guard or someone coming out to stop them, and Allen Ginsberg's chanting Tibetan mantras, and it was just the spectacle and the humor. For me, that was really inspiring, and we used their tactic of throwing money when we organized the action against George Clooney and Hillary Clinton to protest the money in politics. So, I think they threw money into the Wall Street Stock Exchange, and people just went nuts.
They did. It's funny. I worked with Abby over a number of years, and, another place, I mean, he really also helped me learn about foreign policy, which is not something that I knew a lot about, because I met him when I was like in my early 20s, and got me involved in the fighting the U.S. war in Central America. But as he continued to stay in that work, he also worked with Amy Carter and got the CIA thrown off of campus around the same time that I was organizing a massive shutdown of the CIA in 1987.
And I wanted to talk to you about that, actually. That's a great segue into talking about the action. How do you approach organizing an action against the CIA, against the Central Intelligence? And can you tell a little bit about your approach to that, and what were some of the successes and failures from that?
Well, part of it is with great care, because it was actually during that organizing that I had the lug nuts on my car loosened twice. And it was, we have to understand that this work to change the world, especially if you're going to take on the government, is dangerous work. It's not a joke. It's not a game. There's real consequences. And, it was part of a weekend mobilization with a lot of different national organizations, with a march and rally and a lobby day. And it was risky for that coalition to take on civil disobedience. And, like all big mass actions, there's the whole making sure that you have the people that are coming, that you have the people trained to take the risks. And I loved this back then. We trained like 1,000 people on the east lawn of the Capitol. And it's funny, I've done this over many years now, as you go to the point of power to do your training and prep. We worked in 3 different mobile teams to go to each entrance of the CIA. We did have larger numbers. We had a lot of people who were whistleblowers on the government, including Daniel Ellsberg there. People, ex-CIA agents who spoke their truth to power. And, it was another lesson is that part of our impact is that by virtue of our actions, we shut down traffic across Northern Virginia. And I also began to learn the power of impacting traffic, because the media always covers traffic. But, we were on the front page of every major newspaper across the country. I think the people that participated had their life really transformed because we shut down the CIA. And, there was some brutality as part of that action. There were some people that refused to cooperate and stayed in jail. And I can't say that one action at the CIA made all the difference, but the entire movement to stop a U.S. war in Nicaragua and El Salvador and Central America, I do believe made a big difference, because the U.S. wanted to invade Nicaragua so badly, and we're not ever able to do that. So I feel pretty good about the work of that movement.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's such an important concept, is people being able to understand that it is possible for the people to rise up and actually create a favorable outcome. Like, I do believe also that we were able to stop the war in Syria as well. Like, I think we didn't stop all of the pouring of guns into the region, but I think the resistance that was created to that pushed Obama to not actually send another stupid interventionist war, another invasion, another incursion. But what goes into it for you in terms of preparing for an action? What do you think are some common mistakes, or what do you think is really important when you're going into preparing for one of those mass mobilizations?
Mm-hmm. Big question, but a couple different things. And it ties into what we spoke about earlier. I think we have to understand that one of our goals is not just about tangible positive outcomes, which we want to win, but also about the nature of the organizing itself and what happens with people who come together to do this work, and the relationships we build and the networks we build is as valuable as the outcomes. Because this is long haul work, right? We've over my many decades, I've moved, I've worked on many issues, but the relationships I've built over time, we continue to come back together. It's like a long road to justice, and our paths keep crossing. And I think that's super important. I think another piece that I've been thinking a lot about lately, Jay, is, we have to be willing to take risks. And, by virtue of a lot of the different models of organization that our movements are structured in, labor unions, nonprofits, community-based groups, as they get bigger, they have a lot more assets, a lot more to lose. And it means that there's a lot more tamping down of a willingness to take risks. And it's interesting, when I was writing this book, I learned about what's called this complexity science, or the science of complexity, which is the science of how natural organic systems change. And as I read this, I was like, wow, this is the science behind why direct action network movements work. But there was this one concept called the edge of chaos. And that's the place, like that tipping point where something new can emerge. And, people are afraid of chaos. People are afraid of this idea. And I like to talk about it as more organized chaos or an organized crisis, because I actually have seen over my years that we are up against such, huge institutions and people with so much power that we've got to be able to be willing to take great risks and disrupt their world as they know it. And it's that kind of orientation to our work that I think is essential for us to start taking on more and more as we're going into this new decade, because I've talked to people a lot about the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same things over and over again and expecting different results. Our movements have been doing a lot of the same things over and over again, and we're not getting the results that we want. So how can we go into 2020 and be radically different? And I think another piece I would say about this is that, kind of goes along with it, is that we have to stay on the offense. Since Trump came in, I've seen a lot of reactive one-off protests.
Yep.
The Muslim ban, we shut down the airports, awesome, but then it moves on to the next thing. The family separation, 600 of us arrested in the Hart building, but then it kind of goes away. How do we stay on the offense and, go forward in ongoing campaigns that are escalating, which is another important concept here, is escalation is key, not only because it's building towards that point of crisis, but it's also allowing ordinary people to take smaller steps along the way. And when you take a step and it feels good and you feel some impact, you're willing to do more. And so for me, all of this work has always been about how do we help people reclaim their power, by taking a series of actions that will have impact. And also understanding that we don't always see the victory in the moment. These people in power, they don't like to be seen doing things as a result of our actions. And so we have to have a longer view of things and recognize that, that was like with the janitors. We did these big weeks of actions. It didn't settle really for over another year, but there was no question that our willingness to disrupt the city of Washington, D.C. and block bridges and just, create havoc for the city was a key to that.
And maybe just mention a little bit about that action with the janitors. What happened there?
Well, we, Justice for Janitors, which is this amazingly important organizing campaign with the labor movement, because it's one of the places where we were seeing huge success when you've seen a lot of labor losing power. Part of it was understanding we needed to organize across the industry, not shop by shop. It was a willingness to do a comprehensive campaign, meaning that we wanted a multitude of strategies, multiple points of entry, pressurizing the boss. It was a campaign that understood the power of direct action, including strikes, workers walking out of the buildings, a lot of creativity, persistence. And the other piece about it that I think was key is that back in the days in the 30s, when we saw millions and millions of workers organized, it was achieved through a process called card check, where the majority of the workers would get together, demand the boss recognize the union. Because industry understood the power of that strategy, over years, the National Labor Relations Board came in and began to move a new process, which was elections. And that's how a lot of union drives happen, is through the election process now. But Justice for Janitors said, no, we're not going to do elections, because we know you might organize against great odds and win the election, but there's no guarantee that you get a contract. And the contract is really what you're trying to achieve. And we've seen, I think, at least 30% of the election victories do not result in a contract.
Mm-hmm.
So what we understood was that we needed to basically organize in such a way that we won the respect of the bosses, and they understood that they needed to settle with us in order for them to continue to go on and do their business and make the money they wanted to make. Just meant they had to share some of that money and share some of the control over
Oh no.
I know, but you know what the truth is? It's pennies. That's the other thing we have to understand, is that we fight so hard and we win sometimes, but we are nowhere getting near the share of resources that working people need to have.
That's right. And you said we end up doing the same things over and over again. What are some of the things that you see that we're doing over and over again that are not working?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of them is actually mass rallies.
Mm-hmm.
We've done some big rallies. You can look at the Women's March. You can look at the family separation action. You can look at the climate strikes, right? And what happens is that we spend a lot of time, energy, and resources in turning bodies out. We come, we walk around, and then we get on a bus and go home. What would happen if we stayed? What would happen if the climate strike actually used those bodies to have some economic impact on the days that people walk out? What if we were to go to the halls of power and refuse to leave until our demands were met? So I feel like we just keep short selling ourselves by turning out, but not actually translating that into an act of power and leverage against the people we're trying to change. And yes, it's great for all of us that turn out. It's wonderful. But after you've been to a few rallies, rallies are great. But let's do more.
I couldn't agree with you more, because at the end of the day, if it doesn't actually disrupt their day, if it doesn't make things difficult, if it doesn't make them actually, it's very easy for them to say, oh, look, 500,000 people came out. What am I going to have for my salad today? If it's not going to directly impact them and personally challenge their seat, challenge their structures of power, if it's not going to actually disrupt their day, and make life difficult for them, it's not going to have a big impact, because they're going to carry on behind closed doors, because that's what they've always done.
Exactly. And the truth is, Jay, I think it also gives them cover to do the right thing, right? They have no choice but to do it. I mean, even today, there's going to be a big impeachment march, which is going to be great, but we're marching from Times Square to Union Park. And it's like, that's good. But some are like, let's go to Schumer's office. Let's really pressurize this, embolden him. So, that's another lesson on all this stuff, is like inside outside strategies.
Yes.
That when we build power in the streets, right, it emboldens people that are working on the inside or seeking reforms. We saw that in Seattle as well. It's a key ingredient to the victory there. And, for us to really leverage the power of our movements, we have to enter into a new phase of building relationships and trust. Because one of the things I've learned, and again, Seattle, I know you wanted to talk about it, but I come out of the grassroots, the direct action movements, and we don't necessarily have offices, business cards, desk phones, right? Whereas organizations, they know where to find each other. They know how to be in relationship. And part of what happened in Seattle, we saw relationships built between the direct action network and the labor unions. And when we actually succeeded in shutting down the WTO, and some of the more organizational forces recognized the power of the direct action movement, they were much more interested in trying to figure out how we build a relationship going forward. So we have to move away from distancing from people that use different strategies and tactics and figuring out processes of building agreements that will allow us to all show up with what we do best. In fact, actually, let me just share this story really quickly, because in the Central America movement, the Pledge of Resistance, I think, was one of the most effective models of movement building, because we had a national table made up of all the groups representing all the different, from policy and faith to solidarity organizations, except labor. And they made a decision that they would ask all of their members to sign a pledge and then become part of this local grassroots structure of affinity groups and spokes councils. You know, today, a lot of organizations are always competing to who's going to get the list, who's going to get them to be their members. But in that moment, they recognize that we can't compete on bodies or resources, quite frankly, or media attention. We need to share all of that, and we need to honor the work that different groups do. But if we can get people at the grassroots level sort of self-organized into these networks that are willing to take greater risk and to, as you said earlier, to disrupt the days of the power holders, but to do it in a coordinated way, we have so much more power. But so it means we have to be in better relationship with one another, and we have to enter into a new phase where we're not trying to one up each other or compete. You know, competition is like what this whole free market economy is based in, that, and we can't keep doing that because it's not working for us.
Mm-hmm. It's, you know, one of the concepts of this summit series is solidarity, you know, and I think a big part of that is the hyper atomization of society that Noam Chomsky talks about. Means people are increasingly disconnected from we're more separate and alone. You know, we've seen a lot of dissolution of the family and community organizations, and there's a reason why Amazon is one of the most profitable companies in the world, because we tend to now have this one portal. It's great that we have the internet and technology to connect us, but in a lot of ways, we don't get together as much. And I think that was one of the benefits of Occupy as well. That was one of the things that started getting people out together again.
You know, Jay, I want to. I've been on this book tour, and I've been talking about this a lot, and I just want to share this a little bit. You know, I talked about complexity science, organic living systems. It's about connection, relationships, information, open environments. But we were raised in a worldview around Newtonian science. It's very mechanistic, linear, and about categorizing and separating out. And I began to understand that because I've been doing a lot of work around trauma, because I think that healing of trauma is also an essential new ingredient as we go forward, because I believe that a lot of the toxicity in our movements is rooted in trauma and acting out. And I began to understand that in the realm of trauma, there's been a lot more science around our neurology and, you know, that limbic system, the fight flight system, but we were raised to be part of community. When we were first becoming two-leggeds, if you were outside the tribe or the community, you could die. So our survival was rooted in our interconnectedness, our belonging. But we have been raised in a society that socializes us in these ideologies of supremacy. Mm-hmm. Male supremacy, wealth supremacy, human supremacy, white supremacy. And I began to understand it's no wonder we're so challenged as human beings, because we're born to belong, but we're socialized to separate. And so that healing is a key part of what's needed. And when we come back to our organizing, again, you said solidarity. I'm talking a lot about solidarity because I think that is another essential ingredient for how we go forward. How do we show up for one another? And just like that pledge model that I talked about in the 80s, I keep trying to imagine what would it look like in our communities if we built tables, round tables of like the Black Lives Matter movement, the immigration movement, the reproductive justice movement, the homeless movement, the environmental movement, where we're all at the table. We get all of our members to sign a pledge of solidarity and showing up. So
Mhm.
if a Black person is shot in our community, the Black Lives Matter group would determine the strategy and call, then everybody activates. If ICE is coming to our community, the immigrant rights group would figure out the strategy, the call, we'd all mobilize, right? So how are we showing up for one another with our bodies and our resources? Because I think that we can no longer stay siloed in our movements. With the rise of fascism, the climate crisis, we've got to change our game.
Agreed. I absolutely agree. And we saw some of this coming together with the Poor People's Campaign, that vision. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of the structural versus mass mobilization and this hybrid that's coming together. One of the things I noticed with the Poor People's Campaign, it was so close to that vision you just spoke of. And at the same time, I noticed it was so much work, and we created great relationships, and also that we didn't really break through and create the impact of some of our stated goals, you know. And so I wanted to talk to you about and I noticed you referencing Becky Bond's book and Zach Exley's book, um, uh, 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 what is it?
Rules for
Rules for
Revolutionary.
Revolutionaries, right? So, and there were some really cool concepts that they laid out. So I wanted to hear your thoughts in terms of organizing for the 21st century. What are
Mhm.
some of the concepts you see emerging, you know, versus, you know, some of the old models of organizing and
Well, I
movement
mean, I
building?
think what's been emerging really is the understanding of the power of networked organizing. You know, we saw, I mean, the Rand Corporation did a study about it. Homeland Security after Occupy Sandy, you know, talked about it, how our grassroots, the Occupy movement, grassroots movements have a lot more flexibility and much more nimble, can move quickly as opposed to these, you know, bureaucratic structures. And again, we have an era where, you know, labor unions, nonprofits, community-based organizations are really all in these sort of vertical structures, hierarchical structures. And that's also, quite frankly, what I think is part of what happened in the Poor People's Campaign. It's very much rooted in charismatic leadership and some consolidation of power at the top.
Mhm.
And I think when we're working like that, people tend to just be followers instead of agents of change. We're always looking for direction, permission, what are we supposed to do?
Mhm.
And I believe that part of what we're trying to do is move from that culture of power over those hierarchical structures to a culture of power with, where we all understand that we all individually have power, that we have collective power, and that when we are in relationship to one another, we can have greater impact.
Is that what you
And
mean by horizontal networking and horizontal organizing?
exactly, that would be what I'd consider power with, shared power. Because I think that that's really, you know, again, I look a lot at how the dominant culture organizes itself, and then I think about, all right, what's the opposite of that, and how do we put that in practice?
Mhm.
And everything in our culture is in that hierarchical model. So, you know, and what that means is that organizations that are rooted in a sort of leadership model at the top, there's also a tendency for them to fear their base. And we've got to understand that, yes, you may have power by virtue of your title, and you may have some relationships with people in industry or government, but we have to understand that the forces in industry and government are firmly committed to a status quo that does not ensure that people's needs are met, does not ensure that there's real equity, does not ensure that people's needs are met. And so, you know, it's sort of like we have to understand that the power is with the people, and that the power of the people is also vested in people feeling powerful and feeling like they have agency. And so, you know, one of the things I'm doing a lot of work with Extinction Rebellion, we have a set of demands, we have a set of principles. It's like if you align with those, you are part of this movement. And, you know, and part of our challenge right now is also building out a structure where people feel that they have agency to go and take action,
Mhm.
because we want our actions to be aligned with our principles and our values. Um, and we want to make sure too that the actions that we take are building a healthy culture. Because again, since we're all socialized in all these, you know, ideologies of supremacy, at least for those of us that are white, we tend to enact them. Like the empire is inside of us, and we can do harm ourselves, and we can do a lot of stupid stuff. And so we've got to undo this inside of us so that we can actually be in healthier movement, so that we can actually work in real solidarity with people that are different from ourselves, and create as much leverage as possible, leverage or escalating actions to create the tipping point where something new can fundamentally emerge,
Mhm.
right? And that's what I think we're really working towards.
Beautiful. And that's one of the reasons we stress personal transformation in this series and Be the Revolution.
Yeah.
Because, the concept of paradigm and cultural hegemony would tell us that we have internalized these ideas. It's in the racism, patriarchy, colonialism. This stuff is in the drinking water in this country. And it's important to understand that 97% of our mind is unconscious to us. Very little of our conscious mind of our mind is known to us. I also want to put a pitch in the series. If you want to check out an amazing technique to deal with trauma, emotional freedom technique,
Yeah.
EFT, we do a training on this with one of the original progenitors of it, Sonia Sophia. And so you can actually take what in this series. So I encourage people to check out that one, which is going to be available on replay.
And it's also awesome because it's free.
It's
Once you
free.
learn, well, I don't know about your thing, but the technique of tapping is a free thing that you can take with you anywhere.
Anytime. And, the moment we talk about getting triggered, but trigger's real, your brain doesn't realize that it's, it's associating to a past trauma, but your brain isn't going to function properly. You can actually do the technique, especially if there's cops, if there's riot police, if there's even in a meeting, it's very easy for us to maybe get triggered, or doing a training, if you're doing one of those, if you're doing a training line, something like that.
And Jay, one of the things that I think is really important that you're saying, but I want to just say it in different words, is that if you were born and raised in this culture, or you come here, you are traumatized.
Yeah.
You can't not be traumatized living in this culture that is rooted in violence and separation. And so, again, for those of us that are white, we don't actually understand, like people of color, indigenous people, trans folks, poor folks, they know on a daily basis that their lives are endangered. For those of us that are white, we don't have that same, we have a lot of irrational fears, but we don't understand how much we have been made sick by these systems as well. There's a great book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem that talks about the history of racialized trauma, but it's got a ton of somatic techniques for both individuals and group work. And I work with an organization called Undoing White Supremacy Austin, and we use those techniques every time we come together.
Amazing. That's great. Yeah. And I also a big believer in meditation. For me, I couldn't do the work without it. For me, it's a commitment. It's something that I must do. There's no way I could possibly sustain any of this work. I actually want to get back to doing a little storytelling, because I came into, the sort of escalated organizing through Occupy. That was an experience for me that really had a big impact. But previous to that was, one of the predecessors to that was 1999, the Battle of Seattle against the WTO. And I just wanted to hear, I'm fascinated by these stories. So I want to hear a little bit more about, how did you mobilize 60,000 people? And what went into that? Or just, if you can, just tell us a story about the Battle of Seattle.
Well, like every one of these historic uprisings that happen, they happen because everybody's involved. And that 60,000 people came because you had labor mobilizing, you had non NGOs mobilizing, you had grassroots mobilizing, you had local organizing. So everybody was moving. And it was interesting too, because like nobody knew what the WTO was back then, except for the people that were like in that work. But one of the pieces I've also learned is that when when the publicity starts going out and everybody's doing it, there's a certain momentum. And then, we as humans suffer from like, we don't want to miss things, right? So that's part of like this idea of like making sure that people understand like this is the place to be. And I think that Seattle was that. Mm-hmm. So I had actually been working with the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor, doing it was back in the day when the AFL-CIO had the street heat program. So we were mobilizing lots of unions. But I also came out of the grassroots, and a lot of my friends were organizing the Direct Action Network. And so I, like many other people, I'd also been involved with a group called the People's Global Action. And so everybody was gearing up. So I knew I was going to go. And I got to play an interesting role of kind of a liaison sometimes between labor and the grassroots because I had those relationships. And it was interesting because, these neoliberal forces that we are dealing with that really became brought to the world stage in 1994 when the Zapatistas rose up around NAFTA and sort of ignited imagination around the world about what did it look like for there to be a revolution, not for state power, but against these neoliberal policies and culture. And that spawned a creative movement which became People's Global Action. But those neoliberal forces were putting out through all the media and other stuff this idea called TINA. There is no alternative, and that what is to be is inevitable. And I think that is one of their strategies to prevent us from moving at all and to feeling our powerlessness. Like, because if it's inevitable, why should we bother doing anything? But fortunately, a bunch of scrappy grassroots folks did not buy in. Actually, a lot of us didn't buy in. And we held a different vision, and we put that vision out with boldness, which is, again, I think one of the lessons of nonviolent direct action. Be really clear about what you're doing. And so we said, we're going to shut it down, right? We're going to shut it down. And we have to be clear about that. One, if we want a large number of people to do it, they have to know what we're going to do. But two, it also, when you say that clearly, it also captures imagination and energy. And three, then the forces of the state also begin to try and shut it down as well. And what I've learned is that half the time we do these big actions, the police shut stuff down for us, which can be great. That actually happened in Washington, D.C. around the IMF World Bank meeting in 2000. We did a similar thing as we did in Seattle, but they shut down like a 40-block radius of downtown and told all the businesses to close. It was like, okay, that's awesome. So part of what happened in Seattle is that, like all of these things, and I'm just going to speak from the direct action perspective, direct action organizing requires more than what you would typically do for marches and rallies or conventions, because you are asking people to take risks. And in that case, we were asking people to be willing to go to jail. So preparation that's needed is for sure legal strategy and support and training, direct action training. And in Seattle, we also did a lot of training around jail solidarity, because in the direct action world, we understand that the state is able to continue to do harm, mostly because people cooperate because they're afraid of what will happen if they don't. They don't want to risk their comfort. So in the world of direct action, we know that we take our power back by our willingness not to cooperate. And so in Seattle, we had made a decision that we were not going to cooperate with our arrests, and we were not going to cooperate with the jail system. And if we needed to, we weren't going to cooperate with the court system, or we would use some strategies around that for collective power. So what happened is that people started to converge, and we had organized a convergence space, which again is, in the realm of complexity science, there's this idea that there's all these different parts. But when you put the parts together, then you have this whole, and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The convergence space to me is like home. And it's made up of, we had legal training, we had food, we had medical support, we had arts and culture, we had workshops, we had training, we had strategy work, we had information spaces. So it's essential that you get a space where people can converge, get the support and training that they need, the information that they need in order to go take risks. And we had a really great model for what we were going to do, which was that, the convention center was right in the center of downtown Seattle. And we drew a giant circle around it and put slices of a pie. And as people came and they got trained, we organized them into affinity groups, which are self-organized groups to take action. And it's a model still hope more people do today. But each group would go and scout where they were going to put their blockade. Every night we would do spokes council meetings to make sure that there were enough affinity groups in every slice. Those affinity groups then clustered together. And so we knew on the morning of November 30th that there were enough people who had already planned for effective blockades of the convention center, but nobody knew what they were going to do or where they were going to do it. And then we organized 2 public assembly sites. So that's where I was, at Victor Steinbrook Park, where, and again, this is our learnings over the year, because if you have enough people with a common vision of your action that are trained and ready to throw down, you can absorb a lot more people that are coming into that. So by having these public assembly spaces, we could gather people, give them a quick orientation, a quick training, and then we left in what we call flying squads. And this is a way that we organize people. I learned of it from the auto workers sit down, the occupation of the auto plants. Basically, it's like you'd have groups of workers that were prepared to move quickly to go support those occupations.
That was like one of the first occupations, like real occupations.
Exactly, exactly. And, we used it during the janitors' strikes, and we brought it into Occupy. We've been using this tactic, and it was very effective there. And we understood that we were clear about what we were doing. We were prepared for what we were doing. We understood that it was a risk we had to take because the future of life as we know it on this planet for both the environment and workers was at risk. And we stood in our power, and we faced, Seattle was the beginning of many things. The independent media centers, radical cheerleaders, but it was also the real beginning of a new era of militarized police. And they unleashed on the people with a fury between the tear gas, the projectiles, the concussion grenades. It was a battle. And people, I almost want to cry thinking about, but people took it. They sat there and got sprayed with pepper sprayed, and they got hit with rubber bullets, and they had live ammunition out there too, and guns pointed to people's head. I mean, it was crazy. And one of the things about tear gas and pepper spray is like it agitates people even more. And as the day escalated, and then all of a sudden there's like this curfew and national security, and then what happened is that the police just pushed people out into the neighborhoods, and then it started attacking people in the neighborhoods. I mean, just ordinary people were being impacted by this. And that's that moment where hearts and minds start to shift. And ultimately the police chief had to resign. There were big hearings about all this stuff, and they understood that it was a mistake what they did. We had a right to be there. But it changed lives. That the Battle of Seattle was a game changer. There were actions in like 70 countries around the world. And all of a sudden we went from being really kind of on the defense against these neoliberal trade agreements to the offense. And in the years after it, we fought back against the free trade era of the Americas and finally defeated that. In Cancun, when the WTO came again, it also was defeated. And I guess I should say that in Seattle, the protest in the streets really energized and emboldened delegates from the global South who finally walked out of that ministerial, and the talks collapsed. Same thing happened in Cancun. And the WTO has never regained the power and the footing that it had hoped for. And so, and Jay, I also like to say that I've been doing a lot of anti-war work over these years, and I've come to understand that working against war or militarism is like the belly of the beast. And it's a playing field that the government can easily manipulate around these ideas of patriotism. But the movement for global justice was on the offense against capitalism, which I sort of see as the heart of the beast. And we were winning. And so it wasn't a surprise to me when 9/11 happened, and then the war on terror, because it took us from the offense going back on the defense against the shock and awe policies of the Bush administration and the deadly wars they waged in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so, I guess what I say about that is that we have to understand that we have to continue to keep our focus on these economic systems. We have to stay on the offense. We have to be willing to shut things down.
That's right. And how much lead time went into that Seattle action?
The direct action network seeds were planted in February of that year, but they really started picking up steam more in June. And that's, thank you for asking that too, because especially in the era of social media, a lot of people think you just put up a Facebook event and then like it's all going to happen. But these kinds of things take long-term organizing and relationship building and planning. And it takes time, and we need to give ourselves the time we need to do things well.
I agree. And the other concept that I think for me is important is mentorship. For me has always been important. Studying, understanding that if you're going to organize against state power, understand what you're going up against. Because I think a lot of times it's like the bad news bears going against the Yankees. And you have to really understand the opposition. One of the questions is, how do you guard against agents provocateurs, infiltrators? Is that something that you can actually do anything about? What is your experience with that? We saw that a lot in Standing Rock. That was a big part of the Tiger Swan tactic. Is the Tiger Swan were the mercenaries who were hired by the oil company to come and fight the water protectors. Mm-hmm. What do you do about agents provocateurs, infiltrators? What's your feelings or experience on that?
Mm-hmm. Having some experience with some of them in my life. Well, I guess a couple different things. One is that it's very hard to prevent mm-hmm. government infiltration. Depending on your tactics and agreements, it's hard to stop agent provocateurs. A lot of this, again, comes down to one, knowing our history, because we live in a very ahistorical culture, but we need to know our history of infiltration, COINTELPRO, grand juries. We need to understand what they use against us.
I think I would encourage anyone who's watching to make a note and go and study that COINTELPRO. Also, they found it during Abby Hoffman in the Chicago 8's trial. A lot of the people that were in their midst, ended up being law enforcement and were tested. And these are people who were kind of deep. And I used to hear stories that my friend Steve would tell me stories about Abby going like, that guy's a cop. Like Abby used to be able to point him out.
When you've been doing it for a while, there are certain things that you can get.
What are some of the tells that you've noticed?
When something just doesn't fit. When something about it doesn't fit for some reason, like that was one of my experience with Brandon Darby, who became out to be an FBI agent. He was going to the Republican National Convention in 2008, supposedly having gotten medical training and was going to be a medic. I knew Brandon. He couldn't stand the sight of blood. He couldn't, it didn't fit. It didn't add up. The thing is that when I was in Brunswick, Georgia for the G8 in 2004, there were 150 protesters, but there were 150 undercovers. And so we had 300 in the streets. They doubled our numbers, so that was a good thing. But I'd gone up to the campus and I saw these circles of people that was like, that's really weird. Every age, race, gender, size, shape. And it was like, something's weird about that. And so we sort of drove around and we're going to go scope it out. And they were walking out. And they were walking out with boxes of Birkenstocks and radios and T-shirts. And they had like their Homeland Security badges on. So it was clear that all of them had been, designed to be infiltrators. And so, so you don't know, come in all shapes, sizes, ages, genders. So what I've learned is about paying attention to the behavior. Because unless you can really confirm, you don't necessarily know, right? Because especially in a movement where you're trying to bring more people in, like we were doing an encampment in Texas and these two white men showed up and we were like, this feels weird. Let's assign them to clean the toilets. But we went and looked in their car and we saw a police hat in the back of their car and a gun. We were like, okay, that's confirmation. It's like, hey friends, we want to talk to you. And walked them out. It's like, we're asking you to leave now. So one, if you do know, you have to ask them to leave. You have to remove them. Two, if you don't know, you have to pay attention to their behavior. And again, there's no, so in the case of Brandon Darby, he was organizing in a way that was extremely divisive and disruptive. And so I kept saying, he's doing the job of the state, whether he's being paid by the state or not. And so we
That's
have
right.
to, look at people's behavior in our movement. And when it's toxic and destructive, we have to ask people to step out. And I mean, this is the place that's really hard because we don't have a lot of skills at dealing with conflict in our movements.
Mhm.
We feel bad about asking people to step out, but I've learned the cost of somebody in our midst disorganizing or doing harm is more destructive for us than asking them to leave. But you need to learn how to do it in a good way. And as we're learning more, especially if they're not a cop, what is people's path back in? What is their restorative justice process? And I've been part of things now where I see people acting out of trauma, which can be very destructive. And part of the conversation is like, this behavior, like, you're not the bad person, but this behavior is harmful.
Mhm.
So I think keeping focused on behavior is the key thing. Being willing to ask people to step out, get the healing that they need or the political education they need to show up in a good way. And then the other thing I want to say about this, because I think it's something that's really problematic in our movements, there has been this emergence of this concept of security culture.
Mhm.
And to me, security culture is important and we need to know about it. But I believe it's really important if you're doing a small group, high risk action, like the valve turners. You don't talk about it. You don't talk about it on the phone. You
So
don't, right?
just so people know, the valve turners were people in strategic places at the tar sands pipeline, and they just turned a valve. And one of our friends, Dea Schlossberg, was filming that, and she was facing 45 years in prison just for filming it. And we were able to get the message out on that. And Edward Snowden tweeted about her and saying, just for context, if I were to come back, I would only face 30 years.
Wow.
You know,
Right.
so sorry, continue.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're definitely throwing the book at our nonviolent movements these days.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like, small group actions, absolutely you want to engage in security culture. If you're really trying to do mass mobilization, I think security culture really works against us. I mean, we need to be smart about what we're doing. But I see lots of movements really trying to work on different secure platforms. I just believe it's like, if they're going to get us, they're going to get us. So let's be smart about what we do. Let's be strategic. Let's do our messaging that's high end. Let's take actions that are defensible and that make sense. And, Extinction Rebellion is one of those groups. And like part of Extinction Rebellion's strategy is a willingness for people to risk arrest at a mass scale. But they're trying to be really secure in some places. But I'm like, hey, you're already prepared to risk arrest. Does it matter if they come at you for this or for blocking a bridge? So I think, we live in an era of a security industry that knows how to get a lot of information. And quite frankly, we give so much information. I think people should start being more secure about what they put on Facebook and
Yeah.
all like
That's
all
right.
those like personality tests that they're doing, because they're tracking you
Yep.
and they're assessing you. And that's one reason why Trump is in today, because,
They have
you know,
5,000 data points on every human.
exactly. And they figured out who was vulnerable to what kind of messaging, and then they inundated you with it. So, I mean, let's be clear about, they are tracking us, they're gathering our data, and we need to stop giving it to them.
So what are some tools that you use? I mean, when we're organizing actions, I found Signal to be useful. But are there any tools that you use or practices? Because I find a lot of this has to do with what I'm hearing you say, and what I also agree with is having a process ahead of time. Is really important. So
Right.
what are some of the tools or processes that you use ahead of time?
Well, I use Signal. I like Signal. I think that's important. Extinction Rebellion, we use a platform called Keybase. It's similar to Slack, but it's secure. There's various email programs like Proton Email. There's action network lists. Text loops are good. But part of the process has got to be, how do people get access? And so I was at an event the other day um, where some new people came that had never come to a previous organizational meeting. Nobody knew them, but the organizer there, so excited about new people, immediately put them into the Keybase list, which gives them access, and that's the encrypted space. And I think one of the things is, like, if you're just meeting somebody for the first time, you don't give them access
Right.
to your secure communications channels. Have them join your listserv to get information, get their phone number, build your relationship, get a
Get to
sense of
know them
them.
a little bit, maybe.
Exactly. And then the other thing I talk a lot about, Jay, especially the young generation, because again, I grew up old school prior to like social media and even like the internet. It's like, if you don't have like a list of all the phone numbers or like who all your Facebook people are and their phone numbers, like when they pull the plug, you're in trouble. If you are only organizing through online internet platforms and don't have hard copies or backups, you're in trouble because the state has learned, and we've seen it in a number of uprisings where they pull the plug and shut it down. Um, Telegram is another platform that, I think has been used a lot in Hong Kong. So
Mhm.
there are, there are some good apps available. I'm sure more emerging. Um, uh, so yeah, it's like, what's the right tool for the right need, and how do you make sure you have a process about who gets access?
That's right. And what are you seeing in terms of some of the trends? You talk about what's happening in China. There are uprisings happening. There's the yellow vest movement in France. What are you seeing in terms of some of the trends? There are also some trends happening in the United States with Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement. What are some of the trends you're seeing? Because you have a sort of a long view of
Mhm.
of this history of movement building.
Right. Well, in a long view, people have always risen up against oppression,
Mm.
and economic conditions are one of those triggers. Also, the fight for liberation and one's identity and freedom is another one of those triggers of when people throw down and have had enough. And, we're seeing around the world people rising up. In the case of Hong Kong, while it's been they're sort of in their third uprising, um, it's really about a fight for sovereignty in many ways, about, not letting China take away the culture that they've been raised in for 150 years, which is a colonial culture. It's a capitalist culture. But people want to preserve their life as they know it. You know, Around Puerto Rico, it was a group of radical feminists. You see in Chile the rise of the Me Too movement and women rising up. The Yellow Vest around economics and fair strikes. So I'm seeing more and more that there's a pattern around economic injustice or affronts to one's dignity and identity that are key things, and that on both of those, there's often a certain level of pain. And so in this country, I keep saying, like, why are we not rising up? Where is our Hong Kong moment? Where is our Puerto Rico moment? Because what's happening in this country is unlike anything I've seen in my history. And I know that we could take all the KKK and the Proud Boys and Trump and send them to the moon, and we would still have these problems of supremacy. But under this current administration, there has been such an assault on our psyche, such an assault on people's bodies, such an assault on our humanity, such an assault on the planet, that things are literally spiraling out of control. And I think that they are intentionally working to keep us destabilized
Mhm.
and depressed and demoralized. And we know that there's a real class divide in this country. And what Trump was able to move at least the white working class to the illusion that he was going to meet their needs. And, he hasn't, but people still are, I feel like people are confused about the reality here. But we are seeing the rise of authoritarian government, the rise of fascism, a complete and a bulliness. I mean, I'm kind of shocked about what's actually happening, and that people are not understanding uh, how dangerous a time we are living in.
Yeah.
So, and my only conclusion is that that there's not enough economic pain, and that we are so siloed and fighting on our own on all these fronts, that we're sort of like just trying to put a hole in the dam to keep the onslaught of the flood from coming, that we can't even get like to the other side of that defensiveness to go on the offense and
That's right.
to see what's really happening.
I think personally, I think the pain is definitely there. My sense is that we've just become such an individualistic culture. It's difficult to have a vision of resistance when you're just sitting in your computer and the images you're getting all day are, like you said, so disempowering. And there's also a
Yeah.
reason why the Department of Defense spends hundreds of millions of dollars on Hollywood movies. You know, they actually fund these movies. A concept called cultural hegemony that was put forth by Antonio Gramsci. You can do
Yeah.
more research on that subject, but it's really, we are conditioned. We're conditioned to be consumers, you know,
Yeah.
and that's one of the beautiful things I find about some of these resistance movements is that there's such a feeling when you're in a room with a group of people who are doing something bigger than themselves to take it on. And when you have those little moments of victory, so what for you were some of those moments for you where you just went, oh, this is it?
I mean, every moment that you get large numbers of people coming together, and especially when you come together across the traditional divides of race or gender or class. And it's like, I think that of this dominant culture is the culture of death. I think of our resistance movement as the cultures of life.
Mm.
And again, I've been trying to figure out what's different now than when I was being raised up in this stuff. And I keep hearing people saying they don't have time. And I've come to the conclusion that's because they're on their computers so much, as you said, just consuming all this stuff, which is actually making them sicker. And so, again, part of the lesson, that's part of that lesson that also came out of the Becky Bond book, is like face-to-face organizing on the ground, getting your bodies next to other people's bodies, because our bodies can help each other regulate. So if we're alone at home with a computer in front of us absorbing all this stuff, we get whacked, right? And then we just like demobilized or paralyzed or depressed. But if you're with other people, I keep thinking a lot about the feminist movement in the 60s, how one of the things they did is they formed these circles where women would come together and talk about what was going on in their experience. I feel like we need to be doing more of that. And I've been actually thinking, why aren't we just going into these senators' offices and having a conversation amongst ourselves about what's going on and how we feel about what they're doing to us, right?
Mm.
Because I think that's something cathartic about being with other people, being vulnerable and sharing your lived experience. And because then you also realize you're not alone. We're all going through the same stuff, the same pain, thinking that there's something wrong with us when there's really nothing wrong with us. We've just been raised badly, reabsorbing all this stuff, and we have to, like, that's part of the self-love and the self-healing that we have to do. And you know what? We also can't do that alone. We need each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the strategies for like getting back to that calm, regulated space is getting, social time with each other, being near each other.
And what are
And
some of the practices that you use personally to keep yourself going? I mean, to me, it's unbelievable that you've been able to sustain the level of work you have for so many years. I mean, really, truly, it's unreal to me. What are some of the practices, or what do you do to keep yourself going and regenerate yourself?
mhm. Yeah, when I think back about my life, sometimes I'm like, whoa, what were you
Yeah.
thinking? um, I've always liked to try and have my fingers in the dirt. So I love gardening. I always have tried to eat good food and to cook. That's, eating well as a survival strategy. I like to walk. I like to get out in nature and breathe. Um, love music. I'm working on developing that meditation practice. I'm struggling with that.
Mm.
But somebody said to me once, the only way you can fail at meditation is just by not doing
It's
it.
right. It's correct. If you've sat down, you've won. And
Exactly. Yeah.
even if it's the advice that I've spent the last 14 years studying with a meditation master named Yogi Raj in India. And one of the things I tell people is, people set themselves up with, oh, I have to meditate 15 minutes or 20, and they think that it has to look a certain way. Start with 2 minutes, start with 3 minutes, but do it every day. You
Yeah.
can do 2 minutes, you can do 3 minutes. And then if you do it every day, 3 minutes will become 5 minutes, will become 7 minutes. And then it'll keep expanding. Before you know it, you'll be doing half an hour, an hour. But I promise you, life is going to change dramatically, even after a couple weeks of doing 5 minutes. It's going to
Yeah.
be life changing.
I just saw this article. I might not get it all right, but it was basically like about the culture, and I think it was Denmark, and it was about how they do nothing. And basically the idea was, is like, if you just like are on your email and you finish something, just look out the window for 2 to 3 minutes. Like we are so obsessed to feeling like we have to produce and do all the time. It's just like, just look out the window for a few minutes, walk outside
We
and
become
breathe.
human doings instead of human beings.
Exactly.
That's one of the reasons why, for me, Be the Revolution was such an important concept, because we can get bogged down in tactics and mechanism, and that is so important. We really do need to get better at that, and at the same time, we forget that we are human beings. And I find that as organizers, a lot of times that even myself, I was editing one of these videos, literally editing one of these videos, hearing myself talking about self-care and realizing I haven't taken a day off in 3 weeks.
Yeah. And that thing about human beings, this is a little practice I've been doing as well, Jay. It's like I, like everybody else, have grown up in a culture of comparing and contrasting and judging or criticizing or whatever. And I realize how sick that makes me. And when I realize that we're all interconnected, right, I can now try, and as I look at somebody that I might be challenged by, and I just try and understand or see their being, right, that they are also struggling with the same things, doing their best. They may be wounded, but we are connected. We're interrelated. And it's like I try and see people's being. I try and see humanity, and that's really been helpful to me.
And I want to just hear a little bit more about that, because I think one of the concepts that's also really important is transformative justice, restorative justice, what you talked about. And in our culture, our culture is also very rooted in retributive justice, which means you're bad and we're going to punish you. And we see that also in our movement spaces. What is the importance for you about transformative justice, restorative justice? What does that mean to you, and what's the import of that?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, it's a way of getting out of the dominant culture, which, as you said, is rooted in punishment, which is separating, which in many ways I believe is part of the psychological justification for those in power to do harm, right? Because they can just like, you're the bad ones and separate over here, and we're locking you up. And anyway, so I think part of it for me is that we're all going to make mistakes. Just because we make a mistake doesn't mean we are a mistake, right? Mistakes can be seen as a gift. They can be gold if we are willing to take responsibility for our actions and make amends if we've done harm. I also think that's a piece around accountability. It's like we think about accountability as like we're getting called out, or I think we see it as a negative thing, but I've also learned to see that as a gift. Like if I can account for what I've done, because I have the ability to account for what I have done and offer that to the group or the room, it's actually a gift, because it's modeling that it's okay to make a mistake. It's modeling that we can take responsibility. It's modeling vulnerability, and it allows everybody else to actually become more at ease, because everybody's also afraid, oh, it's going to come to me next. And it also is an act of understanding that, what I do impacts people. So if I say I'm going to do something and I don't, that impacts the group. But if I say I'm going to do something and I realize I can't, I can let the group know I can't do this now. I don't have to feel bad. I don't have to beat myself up, because I've let them know. And so then they can reorganize to make sure that piece gets done. So again, it goes back to like, we are interdependent. In fact, that's the other thing, is like, I think it's really hard to see ourselves sometimes. We can see in others what may be going on in ourselves, like this process of mirroring each other. And so I think this is also something we can understand. We don't have to call out people, call in, but we can actually share with people what we're noticing, right? Explore it more, have some curiosity. It's like, oh, I just noticed you do that. I think I might do that too. Have you ever seen me do that? So how are we coming from a place moving beyond competition, one-upsmanship, judgment, comparison, criticism, to how do we help each other grow, to realize our potential and to be better human beings, because we are it. I do believe we are, by our very nature, have the potential to do great good. Um, and I think we want to. I think we want to, I often say that, human beings need a purpose. We need meaningful work. We need our needs met. That's really what we need. We don't need all these jobs. We don't need all this. We need our needs met, and we need to have a purpose and feel like we're making a difference. And so if we can do our organizing in a way that helps feed those aspects of ourselves, and that makes sure that everybody feels like they belong and welcome, and where we can sit and keep our nervous systems calmed, I think our movements are going to be much more powerful.
Mm.
And our lives are going to be a lot healthier.
Yeah, and for me, that was really brought home. Like you and I met, I think, in a yurt in Standing Rock, and
Uh-huh.
I think we had one of those circles. I think at one point, one of those beautiful circles when the clergy came. Um, what what do you feel was brought to the movement by that? Because for me, the concept of colonization
Mm.
really got brought home for me at Standing Rock, and seeing how colonization, how indigenous cultures, having spent a lot of time with indigenous cultures, I see there's such a disconnect between our way of life and the traditional way that indigenous people have had, have held their philosophy, their life philosophy. But what for you? What was the impact of Standing Rock for you, and what impact do you think that made on our movements?
There were many impacts, several key gifts that I continue to carry with this day. And, one of the things that any one of these historic uprisings or gatherings, again, we bring in our toxic behaviors. And we saw that at Standing Rock. And there was a tremendous generosity of spirit that I think a lot of the indigenous elders in particular brought to the fore, of trying to help people come in a good way, setting the container of sort of what agreements would be, really trying to teach a lot about this concept of consent. Like, just don't come in here and do what you want. Come in here, um, know that you're welcome here if you show up to be of service, to contribute to the community, if you show up to ask for consent and work in a collective way. I think another piece is that, just by virtue of indigenous practice, is a recognition of what is sacred and what is valuable, and honoring and ceremony, which was spread throughout that convergence. And I think that's a piece of spirit that those of us that are non-indigenous, and particularly those of us that are white, have been disconnected from spirit. And I'm not talking about religion, but from spirit. And I think that we're hungry for that. And the leaders at Standing Rock, helped us redefine ourselves from not being protesters, but protectors, protectors of what we love. And I think that shift also is really important, because for those of us who resist, we get criminalized, and it's easy for us to criminalize ourselves.
Mhm.
But if we can reframe and understand that we are showing up and resisting because we're protecting what we love, I think it allows us to show up with, like, in greater power and in full dignity, and clearly and consciously about what we're doing. I think that helps us take greater risks. So, and I think part of it also helps us slow down the urgency of white supremacy. I mean, yes, there was a lot of trauma there. There was a lot of pain there. There was a lot of reaction, but there was also time to just sit, to sage, to have prayer, um, to share meals, to gather around fires. And, so I feel like all of that, um, all of those gifts that filled our humanity, um, any of us that went there left with a little bit of that, little bit more of that in our hearts.
I agree. For me, the concept of having prayerful resistance was game changing, and something we didn't experience a lot of in Occupy.
Mhm.
The prayerful resistance is very much like kind of a us versus them. And one of the things that really struck me was the depth of forgiveness
Mm.
was
Right.
shocking to me on a mass level. They ripped elders to the ground and took people out of ceremony, and they threw people in cages and wrote on their arms like numbers. They put them in kennels like dogs, and pepper spray and bullets, and the mass demonstrations of forgiveness really stuck with me, and that, I think, for me was so powerful, and it speaks to that Gandhian concept of satyagraha, of
Mhm.
truth force. So that was one of the big ones for me. And do you have any advice for a white person who's going to enter into one of these resistance spaces to be conscious of?
Mhm.
That was another thing I think that was really important, is training, the 10,000 or so people that would show up at any given time. A lot of them were white. There was a lot of training. So what advice would you give to for a white person, for instance, that would
Right.
enter into one of those spaces?
Well, first, thank you for sharing that piece around forgiveness. I really appreciate that because I think that that's true. Two, you know, for white folks that are wanting to show up at one of these spaces, um, you know, figure out first whether there's been an invitation. Does the community want people to show up?
Mhm.
Second, learn your history, learn about the communities you're going to, learn about the battles, the resistors, the people that have been organizing. So go informed. Three, if there's offerings of space for orientation, which fortunately there was a group called the Solidarity Team that did put together this decolonial orientation. Attend them. When you go, you sort of leave your own ideas at the door, so to speak. Go in, as humble as you can. Be willing to listen and learn and to ask for what's needed. Don't just make assumptions, because especially in places like Standing Rock or Ferguson, people have a very different lived experience than those of us that are white. So the way a white person might think or assume things, it doesn't apply. So so you need to understand that, and um, bring resources. What do they need? And if you can bring stuff that is needed by that encampment, bring it, or bring money. One of the things, white people have access to money and resources more than a lot of impacted communities. So how do you gather resources and redistribute them? Yeah, I think those are some of the big things.
Mhm. I find also too, being conscious of, yeah, I think a lot of times, because whiteness is culturally prioritized, historically speaking, I think that we feel more of an impetus that our voice should be heard first.
Yeah.
And I find that a lot of times, there's an impetus to take up a lot of space and speak a lot, and we draw a lot of attention to ourselves. And I'm generalizing, but I think that you mentioned going in humbly, and having there's the first thought of, I need to jump in right here, but maybe there's this next second of thought of, do I need to share my opinion right now?
Right. I
You
think
know.
that's great. I think both this piece of being conscious, right? Like the more we become conscious of everything we do, the more better it's going to be. And two, this act of decentering ourselves. Because I think you're absolutely right. For those of us that are white is the norm. We do feel like we're entitled to say what we want whenever, to ask, take up as much space with no awareness about it. And I think that's part of, what you're offering as well, as like, I was taught by youth once this concept of wait. Why am I talking? And I think it's a great practice, like especially when you go into communities of color, indigenous communities, or communities different than your own lived experience. Just wait, just listen, observe. This is another um, process that comes out of permaculture, protracted observation. Just take some time to really observe and learn and see how things are working. um, yeah, yeah, we are very centered in this culture. We need to step out of that center And once we step out, a space will open up in which other things will emerge.
Hmm.
So,
And if into the future, if you have a magic wand to wave across our movements, your magic wand can transform it in any way. What's sort of some of the transformation you'd like to see come into these movements?
well, I've been talking about some of them on this call already, but I mean, I think part of it is one, reclaiming our humanity, which is learning about what has been done to us through these ideologies of superiority and separation, to learn to take responsibility for healing ourselves, our nervous systems, so that we can show up, clear, powerful, in full spirit. Um, Build relationships with other people, authentic relationships, slow things down enough to take the time to really get to know people. Don't just rely on a transaction of I want something from you, but who are you? How do you think? What do you feel?
Hmm.
And be willing to share your story as well. I think there's a piece around, there's lots of informal networks, but how do we make them intentional networks where we know we can count on each other and be in solidarity?
Hmm.
I think there's another piece, we didn't talk about it so much, but it's around sort of strategic research.
Hmm.
Yes, we need to know our history, but if we are organizing to change somebody in power, we need to know who they are, how they operate, what influences them, so that when we are developing or escalating campaigns and actions, we, you know, are going to be more effective at what we do. We'll be more strategic in what we do. Because the thing is that we have limited time, energy, money. So, it's good to know the whole, all the possibilities for engagement, but then choose the ones that we think will have the most impact. So I think there's a piece around strategic research and, escalating action, which I also spoke about. We have to be willing to take greater risks.
Hmm.
And, those of us with a lot of unearned privilege, those white, male, actually can take greater risks. And not everybody can take the same risks. That's the other thing. And that's the other power of this idea of complexity or multiple strategies, no one way, many ways, is that not everybody has to risk getting arrested. Not everybody has to block a bridge because, the people blocking a bridge, they need food. Can
Hmm.
you make food? They might need legal support. They might need medical support. They might need a group across the way on the intersection singing to them or playing in their band. The samba marching bands are awesome. So know that as
That is
Rumi,
so important. There's a quote in your book where you talk about, there's an Emma Goldman quote where you talk, I'll let you share it in your own words, about the importance of celebration. And there's no reason it can't be fun. It can be
exactly,
fun.
right? We have to have fun.
What was that Emma
I mean,
Goldman quote? I don't want to be part of a revolution that doesn't have dancing, something like that.
yeah, that's a famous Emma quote. If I can't dance, this is my revolution.
Yeah, that's right.
Um, No, I mean, Jay, I think that's actually really important. Things are really hard. What we're up against is really hard. It's really dangerous. I often talk about two fundamental strategies for change: dismantling those ideologies, structures, processes of oppression, harm, while simultaneously building up ideologies, processes, structures of liberation.
Mm.
And that's another reason why I think direct action is so important. It's because it does require a higher level of organizing to support people and being whole, it, meeting all their needs. It really lays down that prefigurative process of creating like the world we want as we do it. And the world we want needs to have play and joy and community and art and song. And so the more we bring that into our actions, the more people are going to want to come.
Mm.
There's a time and place for everything. There's a time for funeral marches and somber actions, but they can still be beautiful and attractive. And there's time for like completely ridiculous
Gonzo.
things too, because that's the other thing. And I've been doing this training, escalating resistance. I have this slide of when we were in Prague against the IMF World Bank, and there was what was called the pink and silver block, and people were dressed in these crazy outfits and spires and pink and silver, and literally the cops are like backing up because they have no idea what to do. you know? And so like, how do we go outside the ordinary? How do we go outside of their experience? Because that's, you know, power is relational. Everything we're doing is trying to shift those dynamics of power. And the more outside we can be their realm, the less unsure they are of how to proceed.
Yeah, and they use, I think the Yugoslav revolution used a lot of those humor tactics. You can research some of that, but that's the one of the thing. Like if you go and pull the beard of the man, you know, like they want, in my experience, they want you to react. They want you to react violently. You know, they want that anger. They want that reaction because it then gives them a justification to use more force. But I find that when you bring, and again, it's not always appropriate to bring humor. It's not always appropriate. There is definitely a time for more somber actions. But if there is a time to bring humor to it, like Abby Hoffman used to, I find that it also, you know, just from a tactical perspective, it's viral content. You know,
Yeah.
inspired people's imaginations. Wow, it is really impossible. Like when we threw the money at Hillary Clinton's motorcade on the way, the news media went bananas. Like it's like it was the stupid thing of the week for 4 days.
Jay, I just want to say that, you know, when I do my trainings, one of my goals is to ignite people's imagination of what is possible.
Mm.
And when we are living with what appears to be a fairly dire future, you know, and again, I'm not the only one that says this. I know that there's a lot of wisdom emerging because I hear a lot of people saying things, but we have to remember that the future is not inevitable and that, you know, colonization has stripped us of our imagination, but our imagination is one of our most powerful tools. What we can imagine, we can create, and we create things by the choices we make every day. So we need to take the time in our movements to imagine the impossible, you know, imagine what could be, and then begin to think about how do we putting that into practice through the choices we make every day. And when we start doing that, the chance of getting the future we want is much more possible.
I completely agree. And a lot of times we focus so much on the problem, we forget to, and there are actually really good principles in physics that teach us that there's something, human consciousness does have something to do with manifestation. There's actually some good scientific principles, but
Yeah.
we focus so much on the problem, we forget to create a vision of what is the world we want to live in.
Right. Well, I mean, through my organizing, I've learned, you know, you need to know the problem, but problems, people complain, moan, get angry. But it's when you have a solution is when people start to get activated and move. It's like the yes versus the no, right? So we need to know what we're dealing with, but we need to know where we want to go. So that solution is essential. And I guess I don't know how much more time we have, but I want to just share this because I know we're going into 2020 and election year. There's going to be a moment of pivoting towards the election organizing. But, you know, there's been more and more research that has shown the power of protest to influence the way people vote, right? It's the same idea that whenever there's a surge in power, historic gatherings, election, people move to where there's power. So one of the things I really want to say is that as we go into 2020, let's not forsake the importance of protest, of organizing, of escalating, of social disruption in a good, beautiful way to help win this election coming up. Right? Yes, we need to go door to door. We need to do all that traditional electoral work, but we need to act differently in this next decade. We have to stop being insane. And so part of that means what can we bring forward? And one of those things is more creative protest that is an integral strategy to the election campaigns.
And I think one of the things that's really helped nurture that as well is, you know, one of the virtues I think of the Bernie Sanders candidacy is it was the first time we've ever seen a candidate that made getting arrested cool. You know, like you see those pictures of him, you know, getting carried off by Chicago police protesting during civil rights. And I think that had a really powerful psychic effect. Like he made it cool, you know, for a certain segment of young people to like getting arrested kind of became cool again. And I think that was a really good contribution. So the last question I have is, you know, if you had something to say to somebody who might be, and again, I really wanted to, thank you so much for creating this time today. And intentionally, I left space so that we could talk a lot because, you know, I really value your experience, your perspective, and your wisdom. But if you had something to say, a message from your heart to someone watching, you know, you could what would you have to say to them, to anyone that's watching? You can
Um,
just look right into the camera and tell them from your
yeah,
heart
I
to
don't even
theirs.
know where the camera is actually. Um, you know, I think part of it is like never doubt your power. You know, we all have power. And one of the ways you give it up is believing you don't. And it's that power through your choices that can change the world. And I often say to people these days is that, you know, in this moment, we actually have to take each other's hands. We have to walk through this fire. By doing so, we heal ourselves and the land, and we are creating the future we want. There's no way to avoid the darkness that we're facing right now. But if we're willing to deal with our fears, you know, stay connected, um, own our power, and move forward together, I believe we can create something better for all human beings in the planet, all the living beings on this planet and the planet itself. So let's do this, friends. Like, what are we waiting for? You know, if not now, when? Come on, let's rise up, be brave, and love back.
That's right. Ladies and gentlemen, Lisa Fithian, author of Shut It Down, Stories from a Fierce Loving Resistance. Buy this book. Buy it.
Thank you so much, Jay. Appreciate you.
And thank you for all of your work. And, you know, it's just, I really cherish this time we got to spend together today. And
It's been lovely. I've enjoyed
yeah,
it too.
yeah,
Yeah.
me too. So thank you for being with us. Has been Be the Revolution, how to create vision, strategies, and solidarity for sustainable social movements. Lisa Fithian, thank you so much.
Yep. Bye now.